Flying High by js71. Summary. Ochako's class was loud, capitalized. She winced upon opening the door, deciding not to engage in whatever was happening in front of the classroom, instead squinting at the board, finding her name as fast as she could and failing at that. Thank you, dyslexia. She panned down, trying to find the first kanji of her name, not bothering to read the others all the way through, in which Ochako, Tenya, and Izuku are born a year early. Ochako's class was loud, capitalized. She winced upon opening the door, deciding not to engage in whatever was happening in the front of the classroom, instead squinting at the board, finding her name as fast as she could and failing at that. Thank you, dyslexia. She panned down, trying to find the first kanji of her name, not bothering to read the others all the way through. There, at the back, in the corner, away from all the noisy kids. What a relief, was all Ochako could think. Hitching her backpack up on her shoulders and heading directly there, duffel bag bouncing on her leg with every step. There were two others sitting at the back, all three of them lined up in the final row. Ochako slid into her seat, duffel between her feet and backpack leaning against her leg, before giving them a little wave, wiggling her fingers and mouthing a soft greeting. The first boy, who was a short, vibrantly green-haired kid, returned it with a hesitant smile. On his right, a much taller boy with blue, or perhaps black hair, it was difficult to tell, also waved, nodding at her before he straightened, shoulders back, and returned to aggressively glaring at the crowd of noisemakers at the front of the room. Ochako glanced at the clock. Checking out of the hotel had taken her longer than expected, and she was only a minute or so early. She settled in to wait, clasping her trembling hands on the desk and staring at them, doing her best to block out her classmates. That's enough. Her head snapped up. The man in the doorway, black hair, dark clothing that was good night camouflage as it wasn't actually black, and a gray cream white scarf. Looked so done with the world, Ochako wasn't sure she should pat him on the head and tell him it was okay, or book him with a therapist. Maybe both. The kids in the front didn't quiet down enough, and Ochako was introduced to her homeroom teacher, Shota Aizawa, who was excellent at glaring, looking tired, and expelling kids Ochako didn't like very much. She bit her lip to keep herself from grinning as the two teenagers stomped out, making a silent vow to never even hint that she wasn't taking her coursework seriously. She changed quickly in order to get away from the girls who were... Listen, Ochako defined herself as asexual for a reason. She locked her things up, zipped the key into her pants pocket, and jogged outside toward the indicated space. The green boy, who she'd noted as Izuku Midoriya during attendance, appeared only a few seconds after she did, also running up. He hugged himself, shuddering, and Ochako winced with sympathy. Are they? I am not interested in that stuff, Izuku whispered, very softly. Their teacher was standing far enough away that Ochako doubted he could hear them unless that was his quirk, but he dropped his voice anyway. Ochako was familiar with the potential lashback herself, and offered Izuku a fist bump. Me either. He tapped his knuckles against hers, and they were joined by Tenya Ida, the tall boy, who looked decidedly uncomfortable. If the guys are doing what the girls are doing, Ochako said quietly, ensuring that only Izuku and Tenya could hear her, I really hope that Aizawa-sensei is prepared to expel them too. If by... Please, no details, Izuku begged, hiding his face. I live on the A spectrum for a reason. You are another non-allonormative individual? Tenya questioned, which was the weirdest way Ochako had ever heard it phrased. She nodded alongside Izuku, holding her fist up, followed by Izuku. Tenya only took a moment to understand, the three of them knocking their hands together. Who would have thought? Ochako laughed, folding her hands behind her back. Repulsed. Both accounts for me. Coy and asexual, Izuku offered, hesitant on the coy. I'm not certain. Demi-romantic and asexual, Tenya confirmed, Pleased to meet you both. I am Ida Tenya, but you may call me Tenya if you so wish. Uraraka Ochako. Ochako is good for me. Midoriya Izuku. First name if you want. They dissolved into a partially awkward, but mostly boring silence, ending with Ochako groaning and crouching, hugging her legs and hiding her face in her knees. What are they doing in there? I don't think you want to know. She groaned louder, and finally, the other students came out. They were subjected to a 5-minute-long lecture, with all of them but the trio of A-spectrum individuals getting glared at and silently called out. 3 more kids getting expelled, as it was clear that, Ochako could not say that she was sorry to see any of them go. It left 10 students besides her and the 2 boys who were taking their situation seriously. Midoriya. Yes, Sensei? Ball throw record. Junior high. Izuku tugged at the hem of his gym uniform's shirt, blushing. Ochako could swear it had hints of green in it. Was that his quirk? And shrugged. I don't remember, Sensei. Sorry, Sensei. A heavy sigh. Get up here, stand in the circle, throw the ball, use your quirk if you can. Izuku stared at the ball in his hand for a good minute, startling when the girl beside Ochako let out a shout to get him going. Ochako resisted the urge to drop an elbow into the taller girl's kidney, but wasn't about to even test the waters of Aizawa-sensei's patience. She wasn't even considering tapping her toes on the surface of the imaginary lake that was his patience. She was backing up all the way while attempting to look as innocent as possible. In the end, Izuku shrugged, reared back, and went for it, not visibly using any quirk. Aizawa-sensei called the number, then shut up the other students, who started to babble nonsense as Izuku headed back to stand between Ochako and Tenya. Their teacher called up another student, and Ochako vibrated in place, doing her best to appear calm, nervous energy overwhelming her. When it was her turn, she activated her quirk on the ball, gave it a toss — she wasn't risking it hitting the ground because she overthrew — and watched it float away, up towards the sky. Cheerfully, she sat down in the middle of the circle and crossed her legs, waiting for her sensei to call it. That's good, he said, maybe a few minutes later. Release it. Hopefully it was floating in space, or would burn up on re-entry. Ochako really didn't want to nail some little kid on the head as they walked to preschool. She obeyed her sensei either way and headed back to her spot in the line, waiting for the rest to finish up. One girl, the one who'd catcalled and been told repeatedly to shut up, and also not even appeared like she'd been trying, was sent packing, storing away in a flurry of mascara and dramatic tears. Ochako whispered a very quiet yes under her breath, giving Aizawa-sensei her most innocent smile. He didn't comment. The 3 of them killed it in the next event, which was the standing long jump. Tenya surpassed the sandpit entirely, as did Ochako, and Izuku took off into the air and flew along until he'd surpassed them both, setting down with a smirk of knowing delight. The sprint was harder on them, excluding Tenya, but they all got good enough times and moved on to the side steps, the grip strength, flexibility, a distance run, and a sit-up competition that Tenya beat them all in. Ochako flopped to the ground at the end of the distance run, heaving for air. She'd beat everyone but Tenya and tied with Izuku, who was doubled over himself, wheezing. Good job, she coughed out, waving a hand in his general direction. He smacked it in a clumsy high-five and forced himself to stand straight, holding his hands above his head, trying to get rid of the probable stitch he was dealing with. Ochako, I must insist you stand, Tenya declared, appearing in her field of vision. He had glasses. That was nice. You are doing yourself no favors lying on the ground like that. She groaned. Help me up. He offered her a hand. 4 more kids were booted from their class, and that left only 2 besides Ochako's little group. It was a girl and a boy who'd been managing to take the tests only a slight bit more seriously than the already expelled kids, but not more than Ochako's group, coming nowhere even close to them. Ochako really hoped she wouldn't get kicked out. She'd been training for months, even before the entrance exam, and continued to do so after the acceptance letter had come, signing up for rudimentary first aid classes, drop-in martial arts and yoga, doing whatever she thought might prove to be useful in the coming year. The three of them joined up outside the changing rooms, all lugging their backpacks and overnight bags. Hair damp from the lightning-quick showers and uniforms still crisp as they returned to homeroom. Aizawa-sensei looked like he'd passed out on the desk, and Ochako swallowed, setting her bags down on her desk and approaching him. She glanced at Izuku, who'd followed her, despite not knowing what she would be doing, and then at Tenya, who was busy with the student handbook. She reached out and rapped her knuckles on the desk. "Aizawa-sensei?" He groaned, and her heart skipped a beat. Not dead then. "What?" "Nothing. I just wanted to make sure you're okay." He lifted his head, expression deadpan, as much so as his voice. "Your class is full of morons, and I need an excuse to expel the final two." "Oh." "Go back to your seats, Uraraka, Midoriya. You're not in trouble." He went back to sleeping. Ochako elected to return to her seat. True to his word, 16 minutes later, there were only 3 students left, sitting in a row in the back of the class. Aizawa-sensei sighed, heading towards the door. "Come on then. Might as well get you 3 into the dorms." The dorms were set up to host 20 students at a time. With only 3, their teacher just herded them into the rooms closest to the community space of a living room, kitchen, and dining area, and told them not to destroy anything and to get to know each other. He promptly collapsed face first onto the couch and fell asleep. They had an entire afternoon free. They had no homework or anything they needed to do, and unpacking didn't take them long. Ochako had brought the bare necessities, figuring she could purchase some things and survive off that. It wasn't like she didn't know how to be practical to a fault. "I wasn't sure how big the dorms would be," Izuku admitted, drumming his fingers on the coffee table they'd gathered around. "My room's gonna be boring for the next few months." "I, as well, did not know how much space I would have access to," Tenya agreed, chopping his hands like some kind of kid obsessed with karate. "I elected to bring the necessities." "So now what?" Ochako said. "Never have I ever?" 20 questions? They settled on a game of Go Fish, using a beaten-up pack of holiday-themed cards Ochako had been using to play solitaire whilst in the hotel room. They were starting to tear at the edges, wrinkled and soft, no longer stiff, meaning that they had to be careful with them. "Quirks?" Izuku suggested. "We never actually explained what our quirks are." "I can go first." "Sure." Ochako scanned her cards and asked Tenya for a king before she started to explain, picking up a 6 from the pile. "My quirk is called Zero Gravity. I negate the effects of gravity on whatever I touch. 5-finger contact. But it makes me nauseous. You?" "My quirk is Engine," Tenya explained once he'd asked her for a 6. She sighed and turned it over. "I assume you both know the hero Ingenium? He is my brother, and our quirks are near identical, except in location. And you, Izuku?" Got any 4s? "Go first." Izuku picked up, beamed, and set down a pair of 8s. "My quirk is called Flight. It's pretty self-explanatory. Some kind of a mutation in my family, since my mom has telekinesis and my dad breathed fire. Might be from a distant relative, though." "Is your hair dyed?" "It's natural. My grandfather was all green. Me and my mom got some of it, too." "Do you guys want to go rescue, underground, or daylight?" "Rescue." "Daylight. And you, Izuku?" "Rescue." Izuku nodded, offering Ochako a queen once she asked. "Should be good in floods and things like that, is what I've been thinking. Do you guys have any training?" "Self-defense," Ochako said. shaking her head when Tenya questioned her. And some basic first aid, but nothing else. What about you guys? My brother has given me instruction in the past. Otherwise, I cannot say I have training. I have some first aid skills too. I took parkour for a while, but mostly do free running these days. That sounds cool. Indeed. Where are you from? The conversation continued. They did a few more rounds of Go Fish before doing solitaire, then putting the cards away. They sat in silence, both staring at each other, and trying not to stare, the following quiet, slowly inching towards being awkward. So, that happened. Indeed. Their second day at school began with a seating chart. Their classroom was the same as before, but they'd been moved up to the front row to make it easier on their teachers. Not that they've met any of the teachers but Aizawa sensei. The second morning wasn't any more standard than the first morning had been. Their sensei brought them out of class, instructing them to bring their backpacks, leading them through the halls. Usually, I have a class, he told them, sounding mostly asleep. I'll be doing things differently with you three. All of you are on ice. You have to prove that you deserve to be here. Understand? Yes, sensei! He grunted and herded them into a gym, getting them to sit at the wall, on the benches, and pass each of them a brand new notebook. Black hardcovers and labels on the front, one green, one pink, and one blue. It was of no surprise to any of them that they got their corresponding colors. Pink for Ochako, green for Izuku, and blue for Tenya. Those kids, Aizawa-sensei told them, are second years. I want you to write down everything you observe. Write it how you like, so long as it makes sense to you. I'll be evaluating them at the end of the day. No, you cannot leave this bench. Yes, if someone comes flying at you, you may defend yourself. No, you cannot speak to them directly, or sign to them, or communicate with them. Any questions? Tenya's hand flew up. Ida. How much time do we have? As long as they stay in here. Better get going. Ochako flipped open her notebook, balancing it on her knees, and withdrew an eraser and pencil from her backpack, scribbling at the top, labeling it as Observations. She tapped her pencil against the blank page, trying to recall any analysis videos she'd watched on the internet and any writing classes she'd sat through in the past. Just get something on the page, whatever you can think of. She did a quick head count. 19 students. She wrote that down. 2 teachers, one of them being Midnight and the other being Cementos. Ochako added that to her book and considered. They were doing sparring, and it didn't seem like they were using quirks. On her left, Izuku was scribbling like crazy, kanji barely legible, if at all. On her right, Tenya had a third of his page covered in tight symbols, and Ochako resisted the urge to cry. She was an admittedly bad analyst, and when you added dyslexia into the mix, which slowed down her writing abilities by a significant amount, it equaled a great deal of anxiety about the outcome of... Was it a test? An exercise? It didn't matter. She could focus on her failures, she knew, or she could focus on things she could do, such as making whatever she did write down as easy to understand as possible. She nodded and flipped the page, scanning the class again and starting to write. 19 students, she filled out again, with 2 teachers, both pro-heroes. She listed the apparent boy-to-girl ratio, ignoring the squirm in her stomach that reminded her that what she saw wasn't always accurate, and wrote down that they were doing one-on-one training spars in a traditional hand-to-hand format. She listed she was yet to see any visible quirk use, theorizing that they were practicing being in a situation where it would be detrimental to use their quirks. It didn't feel like much. It felt like even less when she closed the book a few hours later, only a few pages filled with tidy kanji, where Izuku had filled at least a third of his book, each page coated in ink, Tenya with maybe a fourth of his filled. Ochako didn't meet Aizawa-sensei's eyes, not ready to ask if she would be getting her usual accommodations. folding her hands behind her back and under her backpack in order to hide how they were trembling. "I want to see where you three are starting," their teacher said, and led them out of the first gym and into a new one, this one much smaller, like a dojo, with powdered walls and floors and even padding on the ceiling. He sat down. "Spar. No quirks. Figure it out." They were just... Ochako was starting to feel like she was being dragged down a spiral staircase, one of those old ones from Europe, which had the stone bricks, and she didn't know how tall each step was because they were all different, and there was no railing or wall, and she was totally blind and deaf. She was used to it though, so she set her backpack down and took her shoes off, removing her jacket and tie, folding them as neatly as she could, putting them near her shoes. She had done some testing when she'd gotten her uniform, and the skirt was actually fairly practical, giving her a full range of motion, with little to no hindrance. She joined the boys in a quick warm-up comprised of a few stretches, and they played rock, paper, scissors to decide who would sit out first. Tenya lost. Ochako faced off against Izuku, lifting her hands, curling her fingers into fists, sleeves pushed up by her elbows to give her more flexibility. Izuku had done the same, tie and jacket by his bag, and Ochako decided to make the first move. It was clear that the three of them didn't really have training. Sure, they had foundations. Basic punches and kicks, a few grapples and throws, but it was painfully disconnected. None of the movements were refined, all of them separate, clear jerks where they had to pause and remember what they were going to do next. It left Ochako's stomach nibbling away at itself at lunch. The lunch itself felt like mush in her mouth, tasteless. She'd never known that food could actually taste like cardboard. She'd always thought it was a saying. Yeah, it wasn't a saying. They returned to the classroom, and the notebooks were given back to them. Izuku was called into the hallway with Aizawa-sensei, leaving Ochako and Tenya to sit in silence and read over the notes that their teacher had left them. Ochako's finger trailed under the lines of kanji that had been marked down onto sticky notes, which had been, in turn, pressed between the pages of the notebook. By the time Izuku had returned from the hallway and Tenya had gone out, she'd only gotten through the first page, 3 notes total for it alone. Most of it had to do with being clear. Despite what she'd thought, she hadn't been as proper as she'd been trying to be, and she felt like her 3rd grade teacher was over her shoulder, asking what the book had been about, and she still didn't know because she didn't know how to... Uraka. Her head snapped up. Aizawa-sensei beckoned her, and she swallowed, hugging the notebook to her chest and walking out of the room. Every step echoed around the class, ringing in her ears, and she ducked her eyes, averting her gaze. She didn't flinch when the door shut, but it was a very near thing. "Your file had you listed as dyslexic," he began, and her stomach started to chew on itself. She nodded. "What accommodations do you usually use?" She'd fought for her accommodations. She was used to glaring down teachers and staff members and getting that extra time, getting that audio recording of the test, getting a computer instead of having to write essays out by hand. Ochako had come to UA with the knowledge that it would be the same. It was the same school system, after all, in essence. She'd come ready to fight for her place, ready to get her accommodations, stay up late and cry over pages of reading and rub at her arms as the muscles screamed. Ochako hadn't come to UA expecting to be asked about her accommodations. "Extra time on exams," she told him, lifting her chin and setting her shoulders. She had to look confident now that she knew she had a foot in the door that had always been locked. Occasionally, recordings of reading comprehension or similar exams, and during tests that are written by hand, I have been allowed to type them on a computer. Sometimes, if it's a big class, I get sent to a separate room to take the exam. Extensions on homework? She shook her head. I don't need them. Do you want them? She froze. She'd never been offered that kind of accommodation. She wasn't sure she was even able to claim it, sure anyone was able to claim it. And besides, she had 4 accommodations that she clung to and fought for. She wouldn't risk nudging a teacher over the edge when she had already gotten that much. If you're willing? Alright, let's go over the assignment. Ochako returned to the classroom with relaxed shoulders, a much brighter expression, and a lack of anxiety so visible it practically shone from her eyes. She took her seat and beamed at her 2 classmates, settling down as their teacher began to explain exactly what the next few weeks would consist of. They'd have more traditional classes in the morning, and the UA courses in the afternoon. They were expected to speak up if they needed help. They were expected to feed themselves breakfast and dinner at the dorms without any incidents, and they went over the student handbook. It felt normal. Ochako stepped back into the dorms with a heavier backpack, lighter shoulders, and a wider smile. She changed out of her uniform and locked herself in the girls' bathroom, standing under burning hot water that felt painful yet so good for as long as she could, and rejoined the boys in the kitchen, wearing her favorite yellow hoodie and sweatpants. Izuku was in a hoodie that, eloquently put, read skirt. Tenya had also changed and was trying to figure out a recipe for stir-fry that he had found on the internet. Ochako herself had never made stir-fry, so she wasn't sure how hard it was, but it didn't seem like Tenya had much, if any, experience in the kitchen. She and Izuku booted him out with copious amounts of teasing laughter, joking about a "No Tenya" sign on the fridge after he questioned how to turn the stove on. They promised to teach him how to do it once they were more settled in, and once they weren't at risk of getting expelled. Tenya, being a good sport, laughed with them and agreed, deciding he could contribute by going over the day's classes out loud as the 2 of them made dinner. They settled into a routine. Izuku, who never seemed to be able to get up any later than 6, made breakfast. Ochako would, in exchange, make dinner. That was her forte in any case, and she didn't mind. While she cooked, Tenya and Izuku would go over their notes, reciting them out loud and quizzing each other and Ochako, keeping her involved. Their mornings were filled with the pain of algebra, trig, and learning how to use a scientific calculator. Their afternoons had Quirk training, rescue training, battle trials, and sparring. They built their uniforms from scratch in a digital program over the course of a week, all of them working together, and tested them out. They became, Ochako realized, a little family. She wasn't worried about getting expelled. She wasn't worried about reading the daily plan their teacher left on the board and taking forever to do so, because Izuku did it out loud, skipping over parts, summing it up as he went. She took her English exams on a laptop with an unfamiliar keyboard and tried to paint as best she could, and failed miserably, just like Tenya did under Nomori-sensei's tutelage. Izuku, however, could have become a professional artist. The days passed as a blur of homework spent at the kitchen table, nights collapsing into her bed, mornings with headaches from reading and writing endlessly, afternoons filled with worn-out muscles and blisters. Sports festival. Ochako felt she was fully justified in her groan of exhausted despair, letting her head fall down onto her desk, making her pencils rattle. Notes. I'm fucking tired and I'll edit this shit later. This concludes the reading of Flying High by js71. Read to you by Mystic Malady.